Not every weapon rewrites the rules. Some arrive quietly, unannounced, carried into battle by crews who don't yet understand what they're holding. The 76mm Sherman didn't announce itself with propaganda or grand strategic proclamations. It appeared in Normandy hedgerows in summer 1944, mounted on tanks that looked almost identical to the Shermans that had been dying in disproportionate numbers against German armor for months. German Panzer crews, veterans who had learned to regard the standard 75mm Sherman with something between contempt and pity, encountered this new variant and discovered that the equation had changed. Not dramatically, not decisively, but enough. Enough that the mathematical certainty of engagement outcomes, the confidence that came from knowing your Tiger or Panther would penetrate American armor at ranges where American guns couldn't touch you, suddenly contained variables that hadn't existed before. The 76mm Sherman was not a war winner. It was not the tank that broke the Wehrmacht. But it was the weapon that forced German tankers to recalculate their assumptions, to hesitate before engaging what looked like just another Sherman, to recognize that American industry had responded to German superiority with something that, while still inferior vehicle for vehicle, closed the gap enough to make the calculus of tank combat less predictable and therefore more dangerous. This is the story of that gap closing, of German crews who had grown accustomed to invulnerability discovering vulnerability, of American tankers who had accepted that their job involved dying in burning metal boxes, learning they might actually survive an engagement with German heavy armor, and of the industrial and tactical evolution that more than any single battle or commander determined how armor warfare in Western Europe would conclude. It's a story about firepower and the brutal mathematics of penetration, about tungsten and metallurgy, about production capacity meeting battlefield reality. It's about the moment when German technological superiority, real and substantial, encountered American industrial capacity, equally real and substantially larger, and about how wars of attrition, which is what the Western Front became after Normandy, are ultimately decided not by who has the best weapon, but by who can field enough adequate weapons to overwhelm qualitative advantages through quantitative mass. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us which World War II topic you'd like us to cover next. The 76mm gun that would eventually equip thousands of Sherman tanks began not as a weapon system, but as a problem statement. By late 1942, American armor officers in North Africa were filing after-action reports that described a troubling pattern. German tanks, particularly the new Tiger heavy tanks and upgunned Panzer IVs, were engaging American Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, penetrating American armor reliably, while American return fire bounced off German frontal armor without effect. The standard M3 75mm gun mounted on Sherman tanks was designed in 1941 when the most dangerous German tank was the Panzer III with 50mm of armor. By 1943, German tanks had evolved. The Tiger carried 100mm of frontal armor. The Panther had 80mm of sloped armor that provided equivalent protection to 140mm of vertical plate. American tank guns designed to fight 1941 threats were encountering 1943 realities, and the mismatch was killing American tank crews at rates that suggested systemic failure rather than tactical shortcoming. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, November 1942. Ordnance Corps engineers gathered around a captured German Tiger tank, recently acquired from British forces who had recovered it in Tunisia. They fired standard American 75mm armor-piercing rounds at the Tiger's frontal armor from varying ranges. At 2,000 yards, the rounds bounced. At 1,000 yards, most rounds bounced. At 500 yards, some rounds penetrated, but 500 yards meant the Tiger had already destroyed you with its 88mm gun that could penetrate Sherman armor at twice that distance. The test results were compiled into classified reports that circulated through Army Ground Forces headquarters with increasingly urgent cover memos. The United States was preparing to invade France within 18 months. Intelligence estimated Germans would defend with substantial armor forces, including hundreds of Tigers and the new Panther tanks that reports suggested were even more formidable. American tankers would be sent into battle with weapons inadequate to their mission, and inadequacy in tank combat meant death. The engineering response took two parallel paths. First, develop entirely new tank designs with heavier armor and larger guns. This produced the M26 Pershing, excellent tank that wouldn't reach combat units until March 1945, far too late to affect the war's outcome. Second, adapt existing Sherman chassis to mount more powerful gun, maintaining production continuity while improving combat effectiveness. This produced the 76mm Sherman. The 76mm gun itself was adaptation of anti-aircraft artillery. The M1 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, already in production and inventory, was modified for tank use by shortening the barrel slightly and redesigning the breech mechanism for easier operation in confined turret space. The resulting weapon, designated M1A1 76mm gun, fired a 17-pound armor-piercing projectile at 2,900 feet per second compared to the 75mm 15-pound projectile at 2,100 feet per second. Physics dictated outcome. Higher velocity meant more kinetic energy. More mass meant more momentum. Combined, the 76mm could penetrate approximately 100 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 yards, compared to the 75mm 70 millimeters of penetration at the same range. This wasn't equality with German guns. The Tiger's 88mm could penetrate 130 millimeters at 1,000 yards, but it was closer to parity than the 75mm offered, and it meant American tanks could potentially damage German heavy armor at ranges where they might survive to take the shot.
Mounting the larger gun required redesigning the Sherman turret. The 76mm was longer and heavier than the 75, requiring more internal space and creating greater recoil forces. Engineers widened the turret ring, reinforced the turret floor, and added counterweights to balance the longer gun tube. The resulting tank, designated M4A1 76W, looked similar to standard Shermans, but was internally transformed. Production began in January 1944 at several Sherman manufacturing facilities. The plan called for gradually replacing 75mm production with 76mm variants, eventually equipping all tank battalions with the new weapon. Initial production rate was modest, roughly 300 tanks per month, but planners expected to increase output as manufacturing processes refined and demand increased. Then, something unexpected happened. The U.S. Army's armored force rejected the new tank. Fort Knox, Kentucky, March 1944. Armored Force Board, the organization responsible for evaluating and approving tank modifications, conducted trials of the 76mm Sherman. Their conclusion, delivered in a formal report to Army Ground Forces, was negative. The 76mm gun, while offering improved anti-tank capability, had significantly worse high-explosive performance than the 75mm. Tank battles in North Africa and Italy showed that tanks spent more time supporting infantry by firing high-explosive shells at fortifications, bunkers, and infantry positions than engaging enemy armor. The 75mm's larger high-explosive shell was more effective in this support role. The board recommended continuing 75mm production and limiting 76mm variants to specialized tank destroyer battalions, not general-purpose tank battalions. This recommendation reflected institutional culture within U.S. Armored Force. American tank doctrine, developed in 1940 to 42, emphasized that tanks should avoid tank versus tank combat when possible, leaving anti-tank missions to dedicated tank destroyer units equipped with higher velocity guns. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, raid enemy rear areas, and support infantry. Tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. This doctrine looked increasingly foolish by spring 1944, but institutional momentum is powerful force. Armored force leadership, many of them cavalrymen who had transitioned to armor in the 1930s, maintained romantic vision of tank warfare as mobile exploitation rather than direct combat. They didn't want better anti-tank guns. They wanted faster tanks for pursuit operations. The fact that German doctrine emphasized using tanks primarily as anti-tank weapons, that German tanks were specifically designed for tank versus tank combat, and that this approach was proving devastatingly effective, hadn't yet penetrated institutional consciousness. Consequently, 76mm Sherman production slowed. Orders were reduced. Manufacturing facilities received instructions to maintain 75mm production as priority. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, only 321 76mm Shermans had been produced, and most of those were still in the United States or Britain, not yet issued to combat units. The vast majority of American tanks landing on D-Day carried the 75mm gun that would prove inadequate against German armor in the hedgerow fighting to come. The Normandy campaign's opening weeks demonstrated exactly what inadequate meant in material terms. American tank crews, facing German Panther and Tiger tanks in defensive positions throughout the Bocage country, discovered that engaging German armor was tactical suicide. Multiple after-action reports describe identical pattern. American Shermans encounter German heavy tank. Americans fire first, typically from ambush or superior numbers. Rounds bounce off German armor. German tank returns fire. Sherman brews up, military slang for catastrophic fire following penetration. Crew, if lucky, has 10 seconds to evacuate before ammunition detonates and turret blows off. The casualty statistics were comprehensive. In July 1944, U.S. 1st Army Tank Battalion suffered approximately 50% losses in Sherman tanks, with crew casualty rates approaching 40% killed or wounded. Some battalions required complete replacement twice during a single month of combat. Young men, trained for 6 months in Texas or California, arrived in Normandy, climbed into a Sherman, drove into combat, and died within 72 hours when their tank encountered a Panther they couldn't effectively engage. This wasn't incompetence or cowardice. American tank crews fought with desperation born from understanding they were outmatched technologically. They used tactics that worked: ambush, numerical superiority, flanking movements, combined arms coordination with infantry and artillery. But tactics could only compensate for equipment disparity to limited degree. When Sherman met Tiger in open ground at combat ranges, Sherman lost, reliably, predictably, fatally. July 19, 1944, briefing room at 1st Army Headquarters, Normandy. General Omar Bradley received casualty reports from subordinate armored divisions and exploded. His exact words recorded by staff officers present were unprintable, but conveyed essential message: American tank crews were dying because they had inadequate weapons, and someone would answer for institutional failure that sent men into combat with equipment insufficient to their mission. Bradley's fury translated into urgent classified messages to War Department demanding immediate shipment of 76mm Shermans to replace mounting losses. Simultaneously, tank battalion commanders in Normandy, ignoring institutional doctrine, began making identical requests through their chains of command. Letters from surviving tank company commanders to Ordnance Corps officers described combat reality in language that mixed technical assessment with barely controlled rage. The institutional response was remarkably swift once battlefield reality became undeniable. By late July, Armored Force Board's recommendation against 76mm production was overruled. Manufacturing facilities received emergency orders to maximize 76mm Sherman output. Existing 75mm Shermans in Britain, awaiting shipment to France, were returned to depots for turret replacement when possible. priority shipping allocated for moving 76mm variants from the United States to European theater. But industrial production and logistics don't move at combat tempo. Decisions made in July wouldn't produce tanks on French battlefields until September or October. Meanwhile, American armor units continued fighting with 75mm Shermans, continued suffering disproportionate casualties, and continued filing after-action reports documenting a pattern that everyone understood but couldn't immediately remedy.
The German perspective during this period reveals a combination of confidence and concern that characterized Wehrmacht's position in summer 1944. Panzer crews, veterans of Eastern Front combat against Soviet T-34s and heavy tanks, regarded Western Front as relatively comfortable assignment. American Shermans were easier to destroy than Soviet armor. American tactics were less aggressive than Soviet human wave attacks. American infantry, while well supported by artillery, lacked the fanaticism of Soviet troops. Western Front meant better survival odds than East. But German tankers weren't stupid. They recognized that American industrial capacity was unlimited compared to Germany's strained production system. They observed that every destroyed Sherman was replaced, usually within days. German losses took weeks or months to replace, if replaced at all. They calculated that exchange ratios, while favorable to Germany, weren't sustainable given disparity in reinforcement capacity. 5-to-1 kill ratio meant nothing if America could produce 10 Shermans for every lost German tank. What German crews particularly noted was that standard 75mm Shermans posed minimal threat to German heavy armor in frontal engagement. Panther and Tiger tanks could engage Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, destroying them reliably, while Sherman return fire was ineffective unless achieving side or rear hits. This created tactical confidence. German tankers didn't fear Sherman encounters in the way they feared Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks or British Firefly Shermans mounting 17-pounder guns. The Firefly comparison is instructive. British forces, recognizing 75mm inadequacy earlier than Americans, had modified Sherman chassis to mount the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, Britain's most powerful towed anti-tank weapon. Firefly could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges, and German tankers quickly learned to identify and prioritize Fireflies in combat. British tank doctrine called for 1 Firefly per troop of 4 Shermans, providing anti-tank capability while maintaining numerical strength with standard Shermans for infantry support. American forces, for doctrinal and logistical reasons, didn't adopt Firefly. The 17-pounder was British weapon with unique ammunition that would complicate American supply chains. More fundamentally, American armored force resisted until Normandy's casualties forced reconsideration. By that point, developing indigenous solution made more sense than importing British weapon system, and indigenous solution was 76mm Sherman, already in limited production. August 1944 marked the beginning of a transformation in American armored capability, though transformation was invisible to most participants and would require months to fully manifest. Small numbers of 76mm Shermans began arriving at frontline units, typically 1 to 2 per company, issued first to the most experienced crews or company commanders. These tanks entered combat immediately, and within days, after-action reports began documenting different engagement patterns. The first verified engagement between 76mm Sherman and Panther occurred on August 8th, near Mortagne, during German counterattack attempting to split American forces in Normandy. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commanding a 76mm Sherman in 3rd Armored Division, engaged a Panther at approximately 1,200 meters. The engagement, documented in both American and German records, lasted 45 seconds. Poole's gunner fired first, using armor-piercing capped ammunition. Rounds struck Panther's front upper glacis plate and immobilized the tank. Panther crew evacuated, and German supporting infantry observed the kill, reporting to their command that American tanks were now equipped with more powerful guns. Poole's crew, equally surprised that their round penetrated, conducted hasty inspection of the tank to verify it was indeed 76mm variant, not standard 75. Gunner's log entry, preserved in division records, got him. 76 works. News of this engagement spread through American tank units with speed suggesting how desperately crews wanted technological parity with German armor. Officers requested 76mm Shermans. Crew chiefs asked maintenance personnel when new tanks would arrive. Tankers who'd survived multiple knocked-out Shermans described 76mm as a psychological game-changer, a weapon that meant they weren't completely outmatched. But German response was equally swift. Within 72 hours of Mortain engagement, the Wehrmacht intelligence summarized reports of American tanks with improved armament and distributed tactical guidance to panzer units. The guidance advised, American 76mm Sherman remains inferior to German heavy tanks in armor protection and gun performance, but represents improvement over standard Sherman. Engagement procedures should treat 76mm Sherman as moderate threat rather than negligible threat. Maintain engagement distances above 1,500 meters where German gun advantage remains decisive. This recalibration from Sherman poses no frontal threat to Sherman poses moderate threat requiring caution represented exactly the psychological shift American ordnance engineers intended. German tankers could no longer assume automatic superiority. They had to consider that return fire might penetrate their armor. This consideration, even slight, affected tactical decision-making in ways that benefited American forces beyond pure ballistic improvements. September 1944 marked accelerating deployment of 76mm Shermans as production increased and shipping prioritized new variants. By month end, approximately 40% of Sherman tanks in European theater were 76mm models, up from less than 5% in June. Distribution remained uneven, with some units fully equipped while others still operated entirely 75mm tanks, but the trajectory was clear. Within months, 76mm would become standard American tank armament.